Jason's hands trembled as he sat at the piano, his teacher's mocking smile cutting through him. "Try not to embarrass yourself," Mr. Thornton sneered. Jason took a deep breath, and then played something so powerful the entire room fell silent. What happened next left everyone stunned, especially Mr. Thornton. But let's start from the beginning. Jason Williams sat at the old, slightly worn piano in his school's music room, his heart thudding so loudly he could barely hear his own thoughts. His hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly as he fought to steady his breathing. The room smelled faintly of dust and polished wood, and the harsh fluorescent lights overhead made everything feel colder than it was. Jason could feel the weight of the other students' eyes on him, a low murmur of whispers behind him, fueling his growing anxiety. Mr. Thornton, the school's music teacher, stood a few feet away with his arms crossed over his chest. He was an older man with graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a permanent scowl etched into his face. Thornton's reputation was well known: strict, condescending, and not particularly encouraging. But Jason had prepared for this moment. He had spent hours practicing at home, replaying the same difficult notes over and over until his fingers ached. He was ready, or so he thought. "All right, Jason," Thornton said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Let's see if you can handle something more advanced. Play Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven." His tone was sharp, almost mocking. "Unless, of course, that's too sophisticated for you." Jason's cheeks burned. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic. He started to play. The opening notes were soft and measured, his fingers brushing over the keys with care. But then his finger slipped on an F sharp. A small mistake, but enough. Thornton's sharp laugh cut through the room like glass shattering. "Ah, I see," he sneered. "I suppose classical music isn't really your thing. Maybe try something more. In your wheelhouse. Hip-hop? Rap?" Laughter erupted from a few of the other students. Jason's face flushed with humiliation. His fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles going white. He wanted to shout, to push back, but instead, he sat there, his eyes burning. Deep down, something dark and determined began to simmer beneath the surface. He would prove Thornton wrong. Jason sat alone at the far end of the lunchroom, picking at the food on his tray without eating. His stomach was in knots. His mind kept replaying Thornton's voice, that cold, cutting tone, the sneer on his face when Jason had missed that one note. And the laughter. God, the laughter from the other students. His cheeks burned just thinking about it. Michael, his best friend, slid into the seat across from him. Michael was a tall, skinny white kid with messy blonde hair and an easygoing smile. But today, his smile faded when he saw Jason's face. "What happened?" Michael asked, pushing his tray aside. Jason sighed, shaking his head. "Thornton humiliated me today. Told me classical music wasn't for me. Said I should stick to hip-hop." His voice was tight, bitterness creeping into his tone. Michael's eyes narrowed. "What?" Jason's hands curled into fists. "He thinks I'm not good enough. That classical music isn't for people like me." Michael's jaw tightened. "Screw him," he said. "You've been working your ass off for months. He has no idea what he's talking about." Jason shook his head. "It's not just that." His voice lowered, his gaze fixed on the table. "He's never liked me. Always has something to say about how I play. Like I don't belong in his class. Like I'm wasting his time." Michael's mouth twisted into a scowl. "That's bull." Jason's chest tightened. He had spent countless nights practicing until his fingers were raw, trying to perfect his technique. But no matter how hard he worked, it was never enough for Thornton. He wasn't enough. "You know what you have to do, right?" Michael said, leaning in closer. "Prove him wrong." Jason's eyes darkened. He lifted his head, his jaw tightening. "I will," Jason said. His voice was low, calm, but there was steel underneath it. "I'm going to make him eat his words." That night, Jason sat at the old upright piano in his living room. His fingers hovered over the keys. He closed his eyes and started to play. Not Beethoven this time. Something of his own creation. A piece full of frustration, anger, and determination. His mom stopped in the doorway, listening quietly. "Jason?" He didn't stop playing. "I'm going to show him," Jason said. His fingers pressed harder into the keys. "I'm going to show all of them." The school auditorium buzzed with quiet chatter as students, parents, and teachers filled the seats for the annual music recital. Jason sat backstage, his hands resting on his knees, trying to keep them from shaking. His heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might burst through his chest. He closed his eyes and took a slow, measured breath. But it wasn't helping. His mind was already picturing Thornton's smug face. Mr. Thornton appeared in the wings, arms crossed, his mouth twisted in that familiar, condescending smirk. "Ready to make history?" Thornton said. His tone was casual, but the mockery underneath was clear. Jason's jaw tightened. "If you freeze up out there," Thornton added, "just walk off stage. No one will blame you." Jason's hands curled into fists. His breathing quickened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He stood up when the announcer called his name, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the stage. The bright stage lights nearly blinded him as he sat down at the grand piano in the center of the stage. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him. The auditorium was completely silent. Jason's hands hovered above the keys. He could feel sweat gathering on the back of his neck. Thornton sat in the front row, his face expressionless, but Jason could see the expectation in his eyes. He was waiting for Jason to fail. Jason closed his eyes. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Give them something they can't ignore." He pressed down on the keys, but not to play Moonlight Sonata. He played something else, something his. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant. A quiet, haunting melody that swirled through the air like smoke. Then it built, louder, faster. Jason's hands moved across the keys with a fluidity that bordered on impossible. His fingers struck the keys with precision, his whole body leaning into the music. The piece was raw, emotional, a mix of pain, rage, and defiance. It was like he was telling a story with every note. The audience sat frozen, stunned. Thornton's eyes narrowed, his arms uncrossed. He sat up straighter, his mouth slightly open. Jason's heart was pounding, his breath quickening as the music reached its crescendo. He struck the final chord, hard, powerful, and let it echo through the silent room. He sat there, breathing hard, his fingers still pressed against the keys. And then, thunderous applause. The audience erupted, people standing and cheering. Michael was on his feet, pumping his fist in the air. Jason's mother stood in the back, her hands over her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. Even the other students, the same ones who had laughed at him days ago, were clapping. Jason stood and took a shaky breath. His gaze locked on Thornton, and for the first time, he saw something new in the man's face. Not scorn, not disbelief. Respect. Jason's lips curled into a small smile. He had done it, but it wasn't over yet. Silence, and then thunderous applause. Jason stood, breathing hard, his hands trembling. He saw his mother in the front row, tears in her eyes. Michael was standing, cheering loudly. Mr. Thornton sat stone-faced in the back row, his arms crossed, but even he couldn't deny what he had witnessed. Jason walked off stage and into the hallway. Mr. Thornton approached him, his expression guarded. "You Wrote that yourself? Jason met his gaze. Yeah. Thornton hesitated, his mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. Finally, he said, That was impressive. Jason smiled faintly. Classical music isn't about race. It's about heart. Thornton's gaze dropped, and he walked away without another word. Michael ran up, grinning. Dude, that was insane. Jason finally allowed himself to smile. He had done it, not just to prove Thornton wrong, but to prove to himself that he belonged. And now, there was no stopping him.